welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing the latest in trends and development in modern Chinese culture, politics, economics, and social issues. My name is Shannon Tiezi, and I'll be your moderator for our program today. Today on China Forum, we'll be talking about China's changing economy. It's an extremely complex topic, and we're very glad to have two experts here to help us sort everything out. First, we're joined by Professor Pieter Bottelier, who is a senior adjunct professor of China Studies at the School of Advanced Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Bottelier has held various World Bank positions, including chief of the bank's resident mission in Beijing. He has also served as a consultant to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the conference board, several U.S. government agencies, and many private companies. He was also a Harkness Fellow with the Commonwealth Fund, a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment, and a research associate at the Brookings Institution. Welcome, Professor Bottelier.
Thank you, Shannon.
We're also very pleased to have joining us today Wayne Morrison, who is a specialist in Asian trade and finance at the Congressional Research Service, where he's worked for more than 30 years. He is their leading specialist on China's economy and U.S.-China trade relations. Wayne has authored numerous CRS reports on China, including China's economic rise, history, trends, challenges, and implications for the United States, China-U.S. trade issues, China's currency policy and analysis of the economic issues, and China's holdings of U.S. securities, implications for the U.S. economy. He holds a BA in political science from the University of Maine and a master's in public policy from the University of Maryland. Welcome, Mr. Morrison.
Thank you.
Thank you both for joining us today. And we're going to get started with just a little bit of background on what's actually been going on. Earlier this year, China went through a once-in-a-decade leadership transition. Under the new leadership, there has been a push for economic reform, with the ultimate focus on ensuring that China's economy can maintain long-term growth. So to help us all understand exactly what this economic reform we keep hearing about is, I wonder if both of you could comment on what the main goals are for their reform program right now.
Okay, I'll be happy to start. There has been a lot of discussion in China on the need for a different growth model, which is less dependent on capital formation and exports and more dependent on domestic consumer growth. That was already a central theme in the previous 5-year plan that started in 2006. And probably they would have made some progress in that direction had it not been for the global financial crisis, which started almost exactly 5 years ago in the US with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. It was in reaction to that crisis that the Chinese started a huge stimulus program, which was largely credit financed, which was very successful in reestablishing growth momentum and full employment in the cities, but also had the unfortunate side effect of promoting a lot of borrowing and investment beyond what would have been prudent if the objective of economic rebalancing had still been central. Now the crisis is largely behind us, and the new team has taken up again that objective of rebalancing, has made it a central theme. There is, in my opinion, a lot of misunderstanding about what it all means and how important it is, but it is no question in my mind that it is a central theme in China, and we are likely to see further announcements during the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress in November, when major new measures are generally expected that would support these broad economic rebalancing objectives.
Well, I would just add to that whenever there's a new leadership team come in, there's always great hope that this is going to lead to economic reforms. Under the previous presidency of Hu Jintao, there was that kind of hope that he would continue the legacy of Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin. And but many analysts feel that in fact some reforms went backwards, and that China became more entrenched in terms of more state intervention and things like that. That's what the USTR concluded. So there's hope now that with a new leadership in there, that the Chinese will realize that given the nature of the global financial crisis, China can no longer continue to export as a major source of economic growth. It has to find new ways of growth and things like that. So in a sense that the Chinese government always fears the stability of the economy because that's the political game for them. They have to maintain political stability in that country. So the government there will do whatever it takes to keep the economy growing at a healthy, steady pace. And as Peter said, there's much greater focus now on the new growth model with the understanding or the belief that China's old economic model is no longer sustainable. Even in 2007, Premier Wen Jiabao said that the economy was unsteady, unbalanced, unsustainable. So, and this was a period of time before the crisis happened, and it was a period of time when China economic growth, or GDP growth, was over 12%. So even then, you saw leaders in China beginning to realize that the old growth model was coming to an end and the need to move toward a new growth model.
So when we talk about the old growth model being unsustainable, I wonder if you could be a little more specific about what the risks actually are. If the leadership isn't able to carry through these reforms to the necessary extent, what would the consequences be for China's economy in the long term?
The main problem from a global perspective is that China was developing too large external surpluses. And the peak year was 2007, just before the global economic crisis started, when what economists call their current account deficit, surplus, which is the trade surplus plus other current account surpluses, was a little over 10% of GDP, which is off the charts. There's no large economy that can forever have that kind of imbalances. Fortunately, that dimension of imbalance has come way down to around 2, maybe 2.5% of GDP today. So that is moving in the right direction. The other major dimension of imbalance that worried the Chinese is that too large a proportion of national income was devoted to investment. That in itself is not such a problem, because investment is good for long-term development, but the efficiency of investment was declining fairly dramatically, particularly in recent years. So I would suggest that the external imbalance is moving in the right direction. We are still fighting very hard, or they are still fighting hard, to improve the efficiency of capital use, particularly borrowed capital. The efficiency of capital had become a problem in China in recent years. Many analysts have focused on yet another dimension of imbalance. That's the low proportion of household consumption in GDP. And if you look at the statistics, that is indeed a striking number. It went down all the way to 34.5% or 35% of GDP in 2008 or 2009, which is by far the lowest such ratio, certainly for any large economy in the world. So many people attach to that a lot of significance, which in my opinion is actually misplaced. The low and declining rate of household consumption in GDP is not a reflection of a consumption problem in China. In fact, China's consumption growth, household consumption growth, has been by far the fastest in the world for over 10 years. Why the ratio went down so far has nothing to do with the rate of consumption growth, but the fact that investment and GDP growth was even higher. Now, other countries in the region, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, have displayed similar patterns of development in earlier decades when they were at the peak of their growth momentum. So I'm not so worried about that low consumer percentage in GDP. That's a problem that I think will be resolved more or less automatically from now on.
Mm-hmm. I just have a slightly different perspective on that, and that is the opposite side of consumption, and that's China's extraordinarily high savings rate. This very high savings rate in China, over 50% of GDP, is the highest among any major economies. And this really results from a number of government policies that encourage this very high rate of savings. The lack of social safety net is one of them. You know, if people in China don't have adequate health care coverage and pensions and things like that, they'll end up saving a large amount of their money, and then they'll consume less. And another thing that drives it is because the government regulates the banking sector. So what it does, it keeps a cap on how much interest depositors get. And it also has controlled, until recently, the interest rates that banks can charge for loans. And essentially what has gone on is that since Chinese consumers and households have very little investment options because of the closed capital account, they've been putting it in either real estate, which has been more or less speculative, or they've been putting it in banks. Now, in the Chinese banking system, many years the deposit rate has been below the rate of inflation, which means if you're putting your money in a Chinese bank, you're losing money, okay? And in fact, that encourages people to save even more money because they're afraid of what could happen in the future, and that has dampened consumption as well. And what this really has meant is that households in China have essentially transferred their wealth, their income, to the banking system, which has provided cheap loans to Chinese companies, which essentially is a subsidy. So essentially, what we're really seeing is a transfer of wealth from the household sector to the industrial sector. And it's quite interesting that until recently, household income as a percent of GDP has actually fallen, right? So China's economic growth miracle has really not benefited Chinese households as much as one would imagine it would. And again, because of the economic crisis and things like that, Europeans, the Americans, aren't going to buy as many Chinese products. As Pieter said, the investment returns to investment are declining. So consumption is really the last way to go on that. And developing greater consumer demand is just one way of not having all your eggs in one basket, okay? And so for China's long-term economic growth, this is what they need to move toward: much greater consumption, less savings. The interesting thing is it's the opposite of the problem in the United States. In the United States, we save too little and we consume too much. And the China is the opposite. We're the opposite sides of the same coin. So in a sense that both countries need to sort of move toward each other in terms of their economic policies to obtain a rebalancing.
May I comment on that? Because I recognize these comments as very valid, but there's another way of looking at the situation which I think is often overlooked. Number one, there is still financial repression, as Wayne was saying. Deposit rates are often below or at the inflation level, means the returns on household deposits or any deposits are zero or negative. And that does indeed lead to a transfer of wealth from the depositors to the borrowers from the banking system, which tends to increase investment and suppress consumption growth. But two comments on that. A very large part of financial intermediation in recent years has not gone through the normal channel of deposits. There is now a massive shadow banking system in China where commercial interest rates prevail. And very few wealthy Chinese put their money on deposit in the banks anymore. They all buy wealth management products at commercial interest rates, and that therefore has suppressed the amount of financial suppression. The second comment is that in the past, when financial suppression, repression is the word, was the rule, that was indeed a negative in the way we look at it from the West. But there was also a positive, because China's fiscal system was not well developed. And through the state-owned banking system, the state was able to mobilize massive amounts of resources used for investment in accordance with state priorities through the state banks, which otherwise would not have been possible. That means that the financial repression has sustained for many years a much higher level of capital formation, both state and non-state, than otherwise would have been possible. And I think it is not, China's rapid growth is not unrelated to this financial repression. So there have also been positive aspects to this.
But it seems like now, as part of the economic reforms, the China's leadership is looking at the banking sector and looking at possibly reforming the way the state interacts with these banks. I know that's been a focus of Premier Li Keqiang's agenda. So I wonder if you guys could maybe preview for us what you think might be likely in terms of reforms for the banking sector. How far do you think they're going to be willing to go in terms of divesting the state and the bank interests?
Well, I would say that, first of all, the big focus on the financial sector is how to make markets work better. Okay, the perception among many analysts, not all, is that because of political reasons and others, that the government in China, which owns or has control over the major banks, uses the banking system to fund its priorities, and that often that loan decisions are not being based on commercial reasons, but being based on political reasons. So the government is trying to promote the development of various industries, and so it uses the banking system to fund low-cost capital to these industries and things like that. The perception has been within the banking system itself that there's really no rational way that money is being saved and loaned, and this is causing great inefficiencies and distortions. So when capital is really cheap, for example, it can lead to overproduction. So you can have all this excess capacity and things like that. And so they're really looking at a way to make capital more efficient, okay? And that's why they're also talking about opening up their capital account as well. Because if you have income in China and you want to invest it, if you could invest it anywhere in the world, then it forces the markets within China to be more competitive. So much in China, I think, a lot of the economic growth has come from speculation and things like that. Asset prices keep going up and things like that because people have a very high rate of savings, you know, and they want to throw money in it as a way of protecting their very high rate of savings and things like that. You know, the real estate market is a classic example of this sort of distortions where people will go and buy 4 or 5 apartments and things like that only because they want to protect the value of their savings rather as a sort of a rational investment, you know, with options of looking at various opportunities and finding the most efficient, the one that offers the greatest return. So I think that's really one of the biggest focuses within the government, how to do that. Now there are obviously many entrenched interests, because anybody who's getting a benefit, a subsidy, or what have you, who's getting easy access, will not want to have to compete in the market. They're not going to want that, and they'll try to fight that and things like that. And one thing that happened, I think, during the financial crisis is that the sort of more the hardliners in China began to say that, look, our model is far superior because look what happened to the American banking system and things like that. Whereas ours, we didn't go through this kind of crisis. So our sort of government control of this is working well for us. And this is the big problem I think the reformers in China are having, to try to convince them that you know, despite the great success story that China has had in growing their economy, that they've really reached the end of the road on this, and they need to sort of move toward a more market-based economy.
You asked about banking reforms. Let me add that in China's financial systems, the banks are still dominant, but their margin of dominance is decreasing all the time. I agree with Wayne that the top priority ought to be, and is, I believe, create and make markets work better. In practice, this means in the next year or two, the priorities, in my opinion, to get the shadow banking system under control fully. It's grown too big and, in a way, uncontrolled, and is potentially a threat to financial stability. I believe that they understand very well what the issues are and have set in motion a process to do precisely that. One way in which you can bring the shadow banking system more easily under control is to liberalize further interest rates, in particular deposit rates. And that relates to the earlier discussion we had, the system of financial repression, which in my opinion has had more positive dimensions than most commentators give them credit for, has to go now. That has served its purpose. So now we have to go to market interest rates throughout, and the shadow banking system will force in that direction. Number 2, I think the bond markets remain underdeveloped in China. They're large in absolute terms, but as a part of the capital markets, they are not sufficiently developed. Corporate bonds, the bond market remains dominated by state bonds, government Ministry of Finance bonds, and China bank bonds. That has to become a much more corporate bond market than it is today. And the third major element of financial system reform, which will impinge on the banks, is on the external side. The exchange rate has to be further flexibilized. Capital account restrictions have to be gradually diminished, even though they have served a real good purpose, I think, and protected China against the 97 crisis and the 2008 crisis. But now is the time to flexibilize the exchange rate and further open the capital account, while at the same time continuing the promotion of renminbi internationalization, which, as you know, is happening at a pretty brisk pace.
Right. I know one of the reforms China has been making is its experimental free trade zone in Shanghai, which is supposed to open Shanghai to make it easier for foreign banks to operate. What do you think of this free trade zone? Do you think it's a good model for the rest of China? Does it go too far, not far enough? I wonder if you guys could just help us understand that a little bit better.
Well, I would just say that it looks like a good start. It looks very positive. And Shanghai really has always been the more reformist-minded city, more open to reforms, more open to IPR protection and things like that. So it's a good place to have this. Also because Shanghai wants to be a financial center, a global financial center. And so the idea that foreign companies, foreign investment would be treated according to MFN principles, non-discrimination, it obviously is quite positive. And this is just like the Chinese, to experiment in this way. Economic reforms in China that began in 78, 79 started with these special economic zones. This is how they did it. They called it, crossing the river by touching the stones. I mean, part of the problem the Chinese always have is that they want to keep the economy going. They understand the issue of promoting competition efficiency, but they're always worried about having their companies dominated by foreign companies and things like that. So that's why they sort of give with one hand, take away the other, because there's always that kind of concern. And so they're going to see and look how opening up sectors to foreign investment and allowing more competition, how that will affect Shanghai. And once that works, they'll probably apply it to other cities as well. This is very typical of what the Chinese have done historically.
I agree with all of that. I also have a very positive perspective on these announcements, which, as you know, are very recent. We're talking about recent weeks, months. Some of the commentaries I have seen related the Shanghai proposals or decisions to the possibility that China might express an interest in joining the TPP negotiating process. If that is true, I would be even more positive, because a TPP without China is potentially very troublesome, in my opinion. So I share all these positive comments. The only additional comment I'd like to make is that you have to watch out that you don't take away too much business from Hong Kong.
Well, we couldn't really talk about China's economic reforms without acknowledging some of the naysayers. There's been a lot of worry, especially earlier in the summer, that China is in for a so-called hard landing, that its economy is in fact slowing down too rapidly. And I know recent data has been more encouraging, but I wonder if you could talk about what your views are. Do you think this economic reform is going to lead to rough times in China economically, or is the Chinese government going to be able to prevent an economic crash?
Well, I would say that, first of all, in 2001, there was this book that came out that made headlines, and it was called The Coming Collapse of China. Okay, so even then you had this sort of like projection that the sky was falling in China, things like that. The same thing happened during the Asian financial crisis and things like that, that China would have a very difficult time. And somehow the government, because it's very pragmatic and because it has a lot of policy tools at its disposal, for example, it has a very low amount of government debt. And so if there were sort of some immediate shock to the economy, the government can move in through spending. It wouldn't really do too much to increase the debt limit, which is a problem we have in the United States. We have to worry about that. So I think that the Chinese have policy tools, and of course they can just turn on the spigot and have easy money and things like that, although that could perpetuate these problems that we talked about in terms of imbalances and things like that. It's something they can do in the short term to promote it. And exactly what they did during this recent crisis. They had a $586 billion stimulus measure. A large portion of it was spent on infrastructure development and things like that. And China was able to achieve a remarkable economic growth rate, while the US, Europe, and Japan and other countries suffered significantly declining growth. So the Chinese have always been able to date, find a way to maintain good economic growth. I think for them it's a balancing act. They got to go ahead and make economic reforms while maintaining a reasonable amount of growth so that not to disrupt social security, social stability. So this is their challenge right now. It's sort of a balance.
I have never really expected that there would be a hard landing. I was nervous, like many other observers, that they might make big policy mistakes which would have increased the probability. But I saw no inherent reasons why there should be a crash or a hard landing. The leadership has accepted a lower growth rate, partly because it makes it easier for them to achieve the rebalancing objectives, but also because they better understood how to manage the shadow banking system, which had become very big in recent years, particularly after 2009. There is no inherent reason why, with economic rebalancing, the economic growth rate should come down. The growth rate has come down from 10 plus to around 7.5 at the present time, more like 7.5, for a number of reasons that have nothing to do with rebalancing. It was, in the first place, the slowdown in export orders and the negative growth of exports in 2009. Exports are still very important in the Chinese economy. And the second major reason why the growth slowed down was the declining efficiency of capital and the overborrowing. A lot of producer sentiment became negative. Consumer sentiment, which have now come up again, were also negative in the recent years. So the psychology was very negative about China, which caused the enterprises to refrain from destocking. And inventory cycles are always very important as lead elements in the economic cycle. So the following points: no direct connection between the rebalancing objectives and the slowdown in growth, right? What we have seen since July and August is, as you mentioned, a more hopeful set of indicators which suggest that the worst is over, that the economy will easily make 7.5% growth this year, that exports have picked up, the domestic service sector growth has become very, very promising. It was always a manufacturing-driven economy. Now we can see the first signs of a service sector-driven economy, and that's very important. Also in the rebalancing, because you are much less dependent on export demand to develop your domestic service sector. Mm-hmm. Also, your employment per dollar invested in the service sector tends to be higher than in many manufacturing enterprises. So it will help on the employment side. So on balance, I never thought there would be a crash. B, I'm more hopeful now that we will be able to balance out at this new lower level, but still very high level of growth from the next few years.
I would just like to add that China wants lower growth because they're more focused on smart growth, not growth at all cost. They've seen the results from terrible environmental degradation to a huge disparity in income. They realize now that what they need is a smart growth model, which means lower economic growth, but not growth at any cost.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you both so much for joining us, and thanks for tuning in to China Forum. We'll see you next week.